Well, friends, here we are in the last Sunday of Epiphany, leaning into February almost already, which is actually there are many reasons why I'm happy the time is going fast. And we've been talking about Epiphanies, right? So we've been talking about it both initially as, just the Christian festival of Epiphany, but then we also talked about it really much more broadly than that, like an idea or a revelation or some kind of shift that occurs in what we're thinking. We've talked a little bit about. I've offered some different epiphanies I've had. I'll offer another one this morning, but I will still have time, lots of time, I hope, today for you to share more of yours. So that's, I think, a poignant thing, because hopefully we don't ever get to a place where we stop having those, but we continue to have expansion in the way that we think about things. We are going to get a little deep this morning. My epiphany will give you a sense of what goes on in my head a lot of the day, and why Kathy has developed like her own method of unwinding that doesn't involve talking to me. Thank you very much, Wardle. New York Times games have been a great, yes, because she'll just recognize the look on my face. She can look across and see that I'm going, and she's like, oh, I don't want to even open that door. So Friday night, Kathy and I, very, very late to the game, we realize, we finally watched Oppenheimer. Our biggest obstacle up to this point had been having 3 hours to dedicate to a movie. And both of us, to be honest, did nap a little during the movie, even though we started it what we thought was pretty early, like 7 o'clock or so. Wasn't early enough. But we got most of it. Actually, not an actual picture of us, just so you know. What I found most intriguing in the movie was the presentation about how all of these ideas sort of came to light, the atmosphere in which this was sort of happening. And you had a lot of these academics who were coming from different parts of the world, who had been to different parts of the world, and how they sort of fed each other. Oh, you have this idea. Well, you need to go study with this guy. Oh, well, you have you need to go over here. You need to do this. You need to do that. That was a pretty interesting to me, how that had all sort of come together. And this was in the early stages of quantum physics. And of course, the incredible math that was used. And then I felt a lot better because at least twice during the movie, you had minds like Oppenheimer and even Einstein say they weren't really very good at math. Like math wasn't, and I was like, oh, great. There's some room for me in the world anyway. And then you got to see also how all of this idea generation occurred in this narrow, sort of sanctioned off world that only garnered attention when it had practical and deadly application. And they brought those people in and sort of created this atmosphere, literally created a town, used them for that, and then, as you really told in the, Oppenheimer was really just kind of thrown out after that was all done. So I'll lead with saying I don't understand quantum physics. But even quantum physicists will say that they don't understand it either. So I guess I'm in pretty good company. And you know what else I don't understand? God. And I'm the God person. Like I've got I'm supposed to understand this, but I don't understand God. I think God is even harder than quantum physics because God does not respond to math like 1 + 1 + 1 is supposed to equal 1, right? In our doctrine of the Trinity. Yeah. Here's the cartoon. It's kind of blurry. So it says, Dad took so long trying to explain the Trinity, I didn't have the heart to ask him about the Electoral College. Another math problem. Yeah. My epiphany about this came when I stopped trying to make God make sense. Why do bad things happen to good people? I don't know. Why does such a thing as pediatric cancer exist if God is love? I can't answer that one at all, at least not logically. And where is God in the midst of death, especially deaths that seem unnecessarily early or cruel? There's no rational answer for any of that satisfies me. Death is a particularly hard one. But I've grown to trust that God works outside of the parameters that we contend with, parameters like, for instance, time. One of the reasons that death is so hard on us is that we are within time. So we experience beginnings and endings, and we're forever trapped in that sense of finitude. But God operates outside of those limitations, and so God sees death differently than we see death. In my sort of imagining of this, God is the creative force, which is the one way that I have a little window into this. For I understand that things can change form. If you take a dead apple core and you put it in the soil in your garden, it fertilizes new life. Life, death, life in that circle. Which is a very sterile, stoic way to think about it. I understand it doesn't help with our emotions at all, but it is at least a way for us to think about how that cycle might work. Our atoms, quantum physics tells us, never die. They just form new things. So do me a favor, pull your sleeve up if you have to, and take a look at your wrist, or anywhere you can see a vein, right? And you see how that looks, there's blueness to it, right? That's hemoglobin that is in your blood, and the iron molecules that form hemoglobin, those particular forms of iron, only come from one place that we know about. The core of dying stars. That's where that iron is made. Somehow gets to us literally in our lifeblood. We are, as Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young would sing, we are stardust, right? We are made of the things that are at the core of the celestial bodies. And that's one way to look at it. Literally made of stars flowing through your veins. And that's one of those things that makes you look and study and makes like your spouse not want to talk to you. And maybe it doesn't make sense at all to you. But what if God is also not rational? We spend a lot of time and energy and effort. I just came out of a long theology course where we're trying to make God rational. We're trying to figure out how God works and trying to put God in a particular box. But I mean, honestly, if we do say that God is love, which is, I think, one of the characteristics we would all affirm in this room, if I said God is love, I think everybody would go, yes, I agree with that assessment. If we say God is love, right? How many of you have experienced love as particularly rational? Never. Right. So that should tell us one thing right away, that one of the key characteristics of God, both biblically and in the tradition, and one that spreads sort of across this denominational soup that we're in, is a characteristic, a descriptor that really is not very rational at all. What is rational? Or what is love? What is love and what is rational? I don't know. Lots of things are rational, but love isn't one of them, that's for sure. So what if God doesn't really care about making sense? Or doesn't care about working in a way that we can quantify and document? What if instead God works like a river, flowing seamlessly, seemingly on the path of least resistance, but that's not really true either, and just flowing whichever direction the river will flow, flowing with a mind of its own? So my epiphany or epiphanal question that keeps coming up to me is, what if we spent less time trying to figure out how God worked and more time just experiencing the work of God? That's what lies behind, that should go on the sign, right? That's what lies behind a lot of the mystical tradition of the church. It's certainly what lies behind an effort like Ken Cox is leading here, these small groups of Ignatian spirituality that are trying to get you out of your head and into your, I was going to say heart, but it's really kind of into yourself, because it's not trying to just move you from rational to emotional, but there's something that is beyond both of those things. I don't think that we're being asked to be irrational about God. I think we're being asked to be transrational about God. So we're not asked to check our brain at the door, but we are asked to consider that our brain is only one of the things that helps us connect. Does that make sense? That's an epiphany for me, because it opens up a whole new way of, approaching things. The choir is headed over to rehearse. We have some percussion today. Hi, choir. Good morning. That sounded like So, that's an epiphany for me that I keep coming back to. And particularly given that, you're at I'm gesturing to Corinthia because we're in seminary, and at a seminary that is pretty rational, tries to be pretty rational about stuff, tries to engage the brain in a lot of ways, which I'm obviously not opposed to. I am subjecting to myself to it again and again and again for some unknown reason. And yet I see it as a gateway, not as the arrival point or the finish line, but as a gateway to something else. And all of that information, all of that rational information helps inform a trans-rational experience that's also not just entirely emotional, maybe trans-emotional. There's something beyond just heart and head, that is like soul work, or I don't know what you want to call it at this point. That's where I start getting into that look on my face that makes Kathy get to the Wordle, right? Comments, or anyone want to share their own epiphany?
It goes along with what you were saying. Paul and I were in Dallas. We both had good jobs. We had all our stuff. and the phone rang one day, and Paul's brother and his family had been in a terrible accident. He was a teacher, and they had gone to Ashland for the summer for him to finish up his master's because he wanted to be a principal. And they were coming back home to North Bend, Coos Bay from Ashland. And if you know Oregon, there aren't a whole lot of roads. No. and they're all up one side and down the other. And they got hit by a logging truck that was full of logs.
Yeah.
It killed their 2-year-old son, who was sitting on Sandy's lap in the front seat because there were no baby seats back then. And Paul decided he needed to move back to Oregon. He needed to be with his family. So that's when we moved back to Oregon. And John and Sandy were in such terrible grief. And they were very faithful people. They just threw themselves into God. They just gave it all over because they didn't know what else to do. And that's when I got drawn in to the Presbyterian Church and going to Bible studies. And well, about a year later, the man, John had no pulse when they came to get to the wreck. And there was a doctor in Coos Bay that saved his life. And that doctor was walking down the hall in the hospital one day, and another doctor came up to him and said, "What do you do if you just delivered a baby and the woman doesn't want to even know if it's a boy or a girl? She doesn't want to see it." And the doctor that saved John's life said, "I know what to do with it." And he called Sandy and said, "We have a little 4-pound boy in the hospital." The mother had a son that was severely autistic. Her husband left her. The husband came back. She got pregnant again, and she knew she had to go back to work. She couldn't handle another child. Well, the doctor called Sandy, and Sandy didn't even ask John. She said, "Yes, we'll take him." And Joseph is a fantastic man now. And I think that's the kind of thing that happens when you give your troubles over to God. That's what I think.
So how was that? Well, hold on to that for a second, because I want to. How was that? How did that change your life? How was that an epiphany then for you?
Well, that was part of knowing that God was there, that He cared when we were in trouble, and when I got in trouble, that's how I learned from them to handle it, just to pray. And I need to pray more often, that's
So it's a very, I think of that story as you tell it, Becky, and think, what a different story that might be from another angle, right? So when we ask, why do bad things happen to good people? We're often asking that question from a trajectory, from a particular point of view. We may not see a different point of view. We may not see 10 years down the road when something has come from that very tragic situation. None of this is to deny pain and suffering or hardship or the very natural feelings that we have when bad things happen to us. It is to say, there's an old Zen riddle, Zen koan, a puzzle, that tells this story of this man in a town who has a son, and these series of events keep happening to him, and the townspeople all say, "Oh, what a blessing," and he's like, "Well, Maybe, maybe not. The son, he gets a new horse, and oh, what a blessing. Well, we'll see. The kid falls off the horse, breaks his leg. Oh, what a tragedy. Well, we'll see. The government forces come in to conscript all the young men in the town, but they don't take the kid because his leg is broken. Oh, what a blessing. Well, is it? Right? So it's this series of things about, what is really good or bad, and what we might label something in a moment might be very different down the road when we think about that. So I think about that for you, in that story, how you could look at that from different angles, and it would be a different take on it. And so, how we just having a little, maybe humility is the right word, about how we think about good and bad and how we define those things.
Yeah, at one point I wanted to grab the mic from you because you're double mic'd. You were starting to
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so the preface to this is this experience changed how I looked at prayer. So for quite a while I had a thread of defeatist perspective about prayer, that my prayers don't produce anything. It's just me talking to God. Okay, fine. My prayers are just, me trying to align to God's will and having a relationship with Him. My prayers never do anything. I spent many years dealing with infertility, and that's where I had resulted. Okay, so fast forward, my husband Chuck developed a pretty intense and early case of AFib in his 40s, thanks to years of drug addiction, he claims. So luckily, we've gotten past that part, but now he's got AFib. Spent a couple of years with trying to do treatment and medication, and during this time, one of the medications had to be administered in the hospital, because one of the side effects was a potential for sudden death in the first 3 doses. So let's just do it under supervision. So we did that. He was already on low blood pressure medicine, so it was already low. They put in the IV, it hit a nerve, it set off the vagal nerve response, and he flatlined while I had a 2-year-old on my hip. At the time, the charge nurse was in the room, saw what happened, put her hand on his chest, basically gave a prayer that didn't look religious because she was trying to be appropriate. And 15 seconds later, he's jumping up, coming to. His body reset. He and I spent the next 48 hours processing that event. Well, longer than that, but especially the time that he had to be in there. He did experience otherworldliness, and said that the only physical sensation that he had was pressure on his chest. The only physical sensation, he said he felt like he was floating like an airplane. He saw people in the room. He was laying on a bed, but this woman was praying against his chest. And that was the only physical sensation that he had when he was not in his body. And that changed my perspective of prayer. Prayer does things. I still, once in a while slip back into my prayers don't produce anything.
Well, sure.
But at least it maintains my relationship. But that experience definitely took me on a different trajectory since then.
Yeah. It's a challenge, right? Because prayer is not it's not a cosmic vending machine, like in the sense that that's often what we want it to be, right? That, okay, so I pray for this and I get what I just prayed for. And most of the time what it is, if not all of the time, is a chance for us to reflect on what's going on, maybe to ask for very specific things, and then to kind of keep our eyes open as to how that comes about, or, it may not be the immediate thing that we want it to be, and it may not have the outcome that we want it to have, and then it also may be exactly, and it's not something that you can explain rationally. But there is something about sort of, it's far beyond the power of positive thinking, right? Which I also think is a pretty puny sort of form of that. But really just setting your energy in a particular direction, which is a prayerful way of doing. It can take the form of a prayer like that, words spoken, and it can also be other things too.
Well, when my paternal grandfather passed away, I was real close to him, and my dad would always come here, point his finger, and he would tell me about my granddad, dying and everything. And once he died, I was emotional, and I was emotional. Tim can attest to this, but I was even emotional after 7 years of him being gone, and because I was real close to him. And then when my father died, and my brother, was the same thing. But, I look at it now and saying, they're angels now, and they're telling me the same thing that they told me when they were alive, and I know they're okay, and they've got their arms around me. I know that sounds crazy, but it's just the way I feel.
Not meant to be rational, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Did you? Yeah.
You talking about how, God doesn't make any rational sense. As much as I still, to this day, still tried to work that out, it just reminded me, years ago, one night, I was 14-ish, I had a really vivid dream of being in an ambulance with a neck brace on, and my head hurting, and the lights going and sirens, and my mother was in the back. And we were going back and forth in the ambulance, and I looked at my mother, I said, I dreamed this. This has happened exactly like it did in my dream. Well, of course, I woke up, and the first thing that struck me in my dream was, if you know what I mean, the dream went very normal. It was just so, but I didn't think anything about it. Well, a few months later, the Saturday after we got out of school, out of 7th grade, I was involved in a car wreck with my mother and my brother, and I was the only one that had to go to the hospital because I had a head injury. Well, the ambulance ride happened exactly the way I dreamt it, which was totally blew my mind. Well, and again, I'm like, well, okay.
Were you aware of that as it was happening?
Yeah.
Did you go, oh, this is exactly?
Yeah. Well, then we went on, and not a week or two later, I went to my pediatrician to get the stitches taken out, and she just did a usual checkup, and she got to my chest and said, something didn't sound right. I got referred to a pediatric cardiologist, and it turned out I had a congenital heart condition that I was going to need surgery for. And the doctor looked at me, he said, had you not had the car wreck, you wouldn't have, yeah. And it's just like, and February 8th this year will be 30 years since surgery. And it's just like, yeah.
So what did that do? The awareness of that shape your theology in some way? Is that like an epiphanous moment where after the realization of that you thought, oh, well, I think right now God maybe works a different way?
Yeah, it's more, I think more that even if you're not hearing God, like directly, or you don't think you are,
Right.
God's working somehow. That, and again, like this, you just can't explain it, but you'll find God in ways that you never totally expected.
Interesting.
Well, I mean, I was in 8th grade, so.
Yeah. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Well, talking about rational, and there is something in us that doesn't really believe we're going to die, or
Right.
that's quite how things should turn out. And by the way, I think rational depends on when you're living. I mean, it's the mindset or worldviews of the people in a culture at a certain time. So we want things explained
Right.
in terms of that. I think a lot of people that
Right.
are, I have a sister-in-law who's she's the epitome of the perfect person following Christ. But she believes that all the answers are in the Bible, and she lost her son a few months ago, and it's been a pretty big blow to her faith because of what she believed. Well, there's a movie out now in which death is a bird. So, and the bird can change shapes, and this mother she visits this girl who's got a very precarious health situation, and the mother and the girl start having these conversations with the bird. Anyway, the mother sort of kills the bird. And so they wake up the next morning, and there are these great groans and screams, and then you just get a view of the city, and people who are not dying, who should be dying, are begging to die. But, you know, it doesn't make sense that everybody who's ever lived, how many people would that be? How horrible would it be to have all those people living that have lived before in this physical world? So just the idea that people shouldn't die ever is really not rational.
But it is like, I think you're right. There is something in us that is that survival kind of mode kind of thing, where that's what we're driven by a lot, even at a base sort of level, our reptilian, brain of survival, that does have us thinking, at least for a big portion of our life, oh, that's not going to happen to me. And one of the biggest things that I have is, in terms of a pastoral task, is with folks who are, and this happens for different people at different times, who are now sort of recognizing, oh, here is this finitude, right? And how do we do this? We talk an awful lot in our sort of culture about how to live well, and we don't really talk very much at all about how to die well, right? Because that's admitting that this thing exists. The bird exists, right? If we just don't talk about the bird, then everything, will be fine. And it really is, in some ways, more comfortable to think that we just have all the time that we need, and we can just do that later because we have time to do that. And We don't.
Well, I have a sister who is really into New Age religion. It's kind of Easternish, who's made me think about reincarnation as a possibility. And about 20 or 25 years ago, when I was in a real bad spot, I started seeing a heron. I live on a pond and birds are there all the time. But the heron would, not the same heron, would appear at really critical times. And I associate with my mother. And it's really, I have like multiple stories of like right after my son's wedding, out there by the pond,
There's the heron.
was standing right in the spot where we had, my brothers and sisters gathered for a picture. And just the appearance, I'm really convinced. I don't know what it is, but I associate that with my mother's presence, God's presence.
Yeah.
But we don't, there's so much we don't know,
Right.
and we don't,
Right. Yeah.
but it doesn't all work out like a lot of churches,
Yeah.
a lot of religions try to explain.
No, and I do think you're right, Kathy, that that rational kind of has a cultural pull to it. So we are from the scientific era. So rationality looks like this, right? Rationality looks like answers. But here's what I appreciate about quantum physics is the sort of the new shift towards where science is headed. Quantum physics doesn't really give you answers. And scientists will really tell you the answers are, this is why scientific theory is the process that people don't understand. What we often call answers are the best theory from a scientist. Scientists are trained to understand that's the theory that has the most evidence that supports it. It's not the answer. We're still asking questions, but we've asked a whole bunch of questions about evolution, for instance, and all of the evidence points at this direction. So therefore, this is our current answer. Now, fundamentalist Christianity doesn't do very well with that. It wants a solid, it calls that answer truth. However, other religions, even the religions out of which Christianity comes, like Judaism, Judaism is very comfortable with not having a set answer, but instead saying, this is the current answer. In fact, rabbis are trained coming up through rabbinic school. You don't read the Bible by yourself. You read it with somebody else, and then you argue over what the meaning of that passage is, and you decide between each other what the meaning is for that day, for that meeting. And if you meet the next day, you might argue and come up with a different solution, right? You might switch. You might switch. That it's that fluid, and it's because what we were going back to, like the angle you look at the story from really matters, right? Which is not to take away from the angle that is your experience. Somebody else might look at the heron out on your pond and think of a totally different thing, which it can be fine too. For you, that's what's happening, and it is dependent upon and feeding all of the other circumstances in your life. Were those different, you might interpret the heron sitting there differently. Right? Yeah.
You talking about Oppenheimer,
Yeah.
and like when one person was like talking about one thing, you like, oh, you need to go talk to this person.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. It made me think about, the Jewish people, how they, like you said, they read together. They don't read it alone. You can't trust your own understanding.
Yeah.
You have to have a community thing. But anyway, that's not what I was going to talk about. So the epiphany I had was a long time ago. Made me realize that the spirit is real. I was going through a horrible breakup. I was not in a good headspace, even suicidal at that time. And me and my dad don't talk often. And he called randomly. Like, he said, my spirit just said, I need to check in on you. And I'm like, I'm lying through my teeth. Dad, I'm fine,
Yeah.
I'm good. Because I'm not out, so I
Yeah.
didn't want to tell him I'm going through a breakup or whatever. And so rationally, you would think the spirit would use someone closer, say my mom, my brother, or a close friend. But yet, she chose my dad out of all people.
Yeah.
You
Spirit
know what
don't
I'm saying?
care.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that wasn't rational, but whatever. So, but it did make me realize that there is something greater than ourselves that's doing things we may not understand why. But yeah, that's all I got.
And you can also, I think, choose to ignore that, right? And in fact, can grow so attached to a particular sort of framework that you can't hear any of those other voices that are saying, you're really on the wrong path here. You really maybe need to consider this. Or here's a voice telling you, how about this? And you don't pay attention. In fact, you begin to perceive those things as threats because they are foreign to the lane in which you are trying to stay. I say this as to emphasize that I think a lot of people are doing this right now as you go through this sort of change that says, hey, you know what? Masculinity could maybe be defined a little differently for you. Some people go,
And they dig in.
right?
Yeah.
And they have to double down because that is so threatening to the way that they've sort of. So part of the truth of a life of faith is that you are open to that deep introspection. You are open to that transformational change. You are open to what our baptismal language is about, which is you're open to a little death and a rebirth, right? To that kind of shift happening. And when you're not, what you can find is a different kind of death while you're still alive. That you're really dead to growth or dead to change, and that usually does not produce good outcomes, in my experience. Tim, did you have?
Just kind of along those lines, I mean, the way we kind of structure reality, so we're closed off to different realities, and, how do you live with contradictions? And I think that's the real challenge of faith, is to be open to new possibilities. Even really science opens you up to new possibilities. So living with that ambiguity, I think, is a challenge to how do you live with so much ambiguity? And to do that, I think we find threatening, and that's why some of these different experiences that kind of upsets our reality, and that's sometimes made the in terms of faith, that sometimes, it leads to an epiphany, to a whole new way of seeing God or experiencing God, or whatever the reality is that openness.
Agreed. That can also be very threatening, right? So can we all appreciate that it's comforting to feel like you have the answer? Right? It's comforting to feel like you know what's going on. It's comforting to feel like you are in control of things. None of us ever are, right? It's just not. That's always an illusion. But we can have some really powerful illusions about that, and they're comforting in such a way that we cling to those answers, and we find, like whether we're taught that the Bible is that answer book. And we can affirm that, and it can be affirmed for us until it's not. Until something happens that we can't work into the answer book. Right? And then that becomes a real crisis. And often people do, like, they either double down and just get more serious about that and insist things that really don't even make sense to them, but they're just going to insist on them anyway, or they just go off the rails, and forget all that and let's jettison it and I go into something else. Always, again, searching for answers. The matter of faith, when Jesus tells us, why do you worry about what you will eat or what you will wear? Look at the birds. They are clothed and fed, and how much more does God care for you than God cares for the birds, right? That is another way of saying, why is the treasurer of the church calling me right now? That's a question that I want to have. I'm halfway tempted to answer this and say, what would you like to say to the rest of the... Yeah. I'll give Don a hard time. You all have to give Don a hard time about that. It's another way of saying faith is being comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Or living the question.
Yeah, faith is being comfortable with being uncomfortable, so that you find your comfort in something other than what usually makes for comfort. Some sort of sense of an answer or some sort of sense of... Now, what is that? That's a lovely saying that will fit really nicely on the sign. It's too long, but other than that, right? What does it mean to be comfortable with being uncomfortable? Well, this is in part what, for instance, if Ken Cox were here, he would tell you that Ignatian spirituality work, that inner work, that dialogue that you begin to have, we might call that prayer, right? We might call that lots of different things, where what you're doing is rooting yourself again in some sense of God's presence that is with you no matter the outcome. And that's challenging because we usually want our prayers to generate a particular outcome. Like we are asking for this particular outcome, right? And alongside of that, if we also start to include in our prayers awareness of God's presence regardless of what happens in this situation. I know what I want, but I also want God's presence to be tangible to me in some way. Maybe, a heron out on the pond, right? We got several. Hey, Becky, do you mind if Anita, because Anita hasn't spoken yet, so we've only got a couple of minutes.
I'll try and make it quick. This was about 40 years ago, and it covers so many of the points that you have talked about. I was in bed, turned out the light, and I heard a jingle and a person saying, "I thought you'd never turn out the light." And this guy had broken in through the front window. He had worked very long and hard to open the painted shut window. And I didn't realize I screamed until my throat hurt, and he was on top of me with a gun held right next to my head. And, of course, I thought, well, it might not be a gun. So I put my hand up and I felt, and yes, it was a revolver. And he said, "Get your hand down." But I was raped. And I also realized that I could die at any minute. That death comes unexpectedly. And I went through a mental assessment. Am I ready? No, I'm not ready. I've got a number of things that I need to do in my life to put my life straight. So the rest of the story is I reached out to a friend, and he said, "Well, you can come and stay with us, my housemates, until you feel better going back to the house and getting the locks fixed and all that." So I went over, and this was like 6 or 8 blocks, half a mile away from my house. And as I'm sitting there talking to a young lady who lived in the group and another fellow as to why I was there, she got very silent. And it came out the same guy a few weeks before had broken in, held a gun to her head, and raped her. And she was in guilt. She thought she had caused it. And she didn't talk about it. Of course, I get rid of things by talking about them and work through it. It was so much of a coincidence because it helped her heal. And I'm going, was God moving in this weird way, with all these coincidences? Because we both healed. And it was an eye-opening experience. And every once in a while, I'll do a personal assessment. Am I ready to go at the next minute or the next second? Because death can come very suddenly. And I don't want to have any regrets.
Did they catch him?
No, I've been planning to check with cold case files, but that was a long time ago. Someday I may.
Anita, thank you. Thank you for sharing that, for being courageous enough to share that. That's a strong story.
Do you think that everyone has a chance at faith?
Everyone has a chance at faith.
Yes. What if your daddy gives you $40 million and you don't ever have anything go wrong?
Yeah. Do I think so? I don't know. I don't know that. I think we're all dealt different hands for sure, and it's interesting that you're making that particular reference, right? So, what does faith look like to somebody who is? So there's a reason Jesus approaches a rich man and says it's very hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, like it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, right? So that's a pretty hyperbolic example, right? Yeah, because it is the moments of powerlessness and vulnerability and dysfunction and lack of control that most give us the opportunity to live into faith or into a trust. We may not engage with those. We may, for a variety of reasons, choose to not lean into that or do something else. We may have been handed a set of instructions about how God works that don't work for us anymore, but we don't know how to replace that with something else. It's a constant theme of this community that people come into here and go, oh, well, wait a second. Like, I'm starting to get some pieces that I can put this puzzle together where I couldn't put the other puzzle together at all. Though they insisted that all of these pieces fit together, they were not. So, yeah, I think it's very complicated, and I think you're right that many of the people who I have experienced having the most in terms of material or cultural, what we culturally call positive things, I see as very miserable, and acting out of that misery, though they have, wealth beyond belief. I think it's a detriment. I think Jesus thought it was a detriment too, which is why he said, "Get rid of it." Right? And your connection to people who are absolutely dependent. This is what he taught. Be with the destitute, be with the marginalized, be with the people who are on the fringes, because that sort of vulnerability teaches you how to be faithful. And that's a really hard lesson for the richest nation in the world.
Even really live a full life, right?
Yeah, what it means to live a full life, though, is a very different thing in the framework of Jesus, in the way of Jesus, and in the way of the United States. Like we are pulling in two different directions, friends. Two different directions, and boy, can you see that right now. Okay. Starting next Sunday, he was wandering in and out of here. I don't know if Justin will start. So speaking of competing sets of values, Justin's going to try another attempt to sort of rescue the book of Revelation for us and to try to understand that even within the imagery that is quite stark and edgy at times, there is this pushback against, in this case, against the Roman Empire, but the characteristic will be against empire, and to think about what that resistance looks like, and to have us consider what the book of Revelation may actually be saying to us beyond the massive misinterpretation of Left Behind, right? Of eschatological theology of the end of times kind of thing. So Justin will come in and help unpack that a little bit for you. So that'll be for the month of February. Ready, break. Good to see y'all.